We're so excited to have you joining us today for the first webinar in the Early Learning Network's Spring Webinar Series. My name is Sue Sheridan, and I'm the Principal Investigator for the Early Learning Network lead at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Our four-part bi-weekly series brings you experts from across the country to share research findings from the network and highlight policies and practices to help children maintain early learning success during the critically important period from pre-kindergarten to third grade. Today, we're going to explore transitions and alignment, an important theme across the early learning network studies. And specifically, we'll be sharing insights and information on fostering children's success as a transition from pre-K to kindergarten. I have a few housekeeping items first, though, that I'd like to cover. Let me start by saying that this webinar will be recorded and also streamed live on our Facebook page. A video of today's presentation, along with the slides that you'll be seeing in just a little bit, will be available on our website by early next week. You can also find details about upcoming webinars at earlylearningnetwork.unl.edu. Because there are so many of you on the call today, which we're very excited about, we did have to mute you, but we do want to hear from you. So throughout the presentation and then during the formal Q&A period that follows, we invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. For those of you who are joining us live on Facebook, you can submit your questions in the comment section of the Facebook Live video. We'll try to answer as many of your questions as possible before we end the webinar. Lastly, you can access closed captions by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. In a minute, I'll turn things over to today's co-presenters. But first, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the network and its mission. So the nationwide Early Learning Network was established in 2016 and is funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. Our mission is to work collectively to advance the understanding of policies and practices that narrow the achievement gap and maintain early learning success as children transition from pre-K to elementary school and beyond. The network consists of 5 research teams, 1 assessment team, and the network lead team. Our research teams are studying children's transitions from pre-K to kindergarten in communities across multiple regions of the country, ranging from rural to urban locations, and representing children and families of various racial, ethnic, and linguistic backgrounds. On the screen in front of you, you see a map showing where teams are located in different parts of the United States. MDRC and the University of Michigan are conducting a study in Boston Public Schools. The Ohio State University's study is gathering data across the state of Ohio. The University of Nebraska at Lincoln is conducting a study in rural and urban Nebraska. And the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's sample is rural North Carolina. Finally, the University of Virginia is conducting their work in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is a very diverse county in Northern Virginia. The University of California at Irvine is conducting a very unique study, a unique assessment study that's part of this network, wherein they're developing and piloting a technology-based classroom observation system known as OLOS. So we often talk about the importance of ensuring a smooth transition from pre-K to kindergarten, but what does that really mean? How are pre-K and kindergarten classrooms different? And in what ways can we improve coordination and communication across these two settings? What policies and practices may help bring children's early experiences to greater alignment to promote a successful transition to formal schooling? Well, today we're excited to welcome 2 researchers from the Early Learning Network who will share their research insights and offer recommendations to address these questions in their presentation entitled Easing the Transition from Pre-K to Kindergarten. I'm pleased to introduce Ginny Vitiello and Kelly Purtell. who each bring a wealth of research experience and expertise in understanding young children's learning and development. Dr. Ginny Vitiello is an assistant professor and research faculty at the University of Virginia, and Dr. Kelly Purtell is an associate professor in the Department of Human Sciences at The Ohio State University. So now I'll turn things over to Ginny to begin the joint presentation, which will then be followed by discussion and reflection and time for your questions.
All right. Hi, everyone. Bear with me while I get everything set up here. We're so excited to have people joining us today as we talk about this work. I wanted to note before I get started, Kelly reminded me earlier to mention that all of this data and this work was conducted at a time when we couldn't even imagine something like COVID-19 happening. So we will try to address potential deviations to our advice or other things that we might consider in relation to COVID-19 and the types of transitions that kids will be undergoing next year in the questions, but just bear in mind that these data came from a pre-COVID period. All right. Okay. So I'm going to start by giving some background about why we think alignment between pre-K and kindergarten might be important for children. Then I'm going to talk about some of the evidence that we have we've found about misalignment related to teacher race and classroom languages, as well as some potential misalignment that we see in terms of teacher-child interactions across pre-K and kindergarten. After each of these topics, I'm going to give some considerations and recommendations for policymakers and practitioners, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kelly. All right, so we're going to start with the overarching question, which is, why should we even be worried or concerned about alignment between pre-K and kindergarten? We know, and we've known for a long time now, that there are substantial gaps between more advantaged and less advantaged children in terms of their performance on standardized achievement tests. And these gaps are already apparent and measurable by the time children enter kindergarten, and they seem to develop across infancy and early childhood. Here is a very classic example of this achievement gap from work done by Lagerfo and colleagues using nationally representative data from ECLSK. I've highlighted white children's achievement scores in red and Black children's achievement scores in blue. And you can see that already at kindergarten, white children are starting just a few points ahead, and that difference between white children and Black or African American children grows over time. If you cut the data economic resources, you see essentially the same pattern. Children from families with more money consistently outperform children with families from families with less money. So one of the ways that we as a society have tried to address these gaps is by expanding children's access to high quality pre-K, so that all children have the opportunity to acquire basic school readiness skills before they enter kindergarten. But unfortunately, in most studies, the effects of pre-K do not persist over time. So we see that children who had public pre-K start kindergarten with stronger school readiness skills than children who did not have any pre-K, but who are demographically similar. But by the end of kindergarten, they've lost much of that advantage that they started with. We call this pre-K convergence because children's skills look like they converge over time. There are many reasons why this convergence may occur. One of those reasons that's been hypothesized for some time now is the issue of alignment or misalignment of children's experiences across pre-K and kindergarten. Aligned experiences are those experiences that support children's development by presenting children with environments that are predictable, meaning that they're not too different in terms of expectations, routines, or the ways that adults interact with children. And they're also coherent, meaning that learning experiences and opportunities for children, skill building and autonomy building, build upon one another in meaningful ways. The idea is that misaligned or poorly aligned experiences may hinder children's development, either by causing stress for children that impacts their ability to learn in a new environment, or by simply failing to provide children with experiences that build upon their existing skills, either because the experiences are redundant and they're learning the same information that they've already covered and mastered in pre-K, or that the experiences are too advanced and children are struggling to catch up. We are absolutely not suggesting that alignment is the only factor in supporting children's success in elementary school. As a network, we are trying to chip away at this issue by studying multiple different aspects of the transition into school and children's experiences, both in pre-K and in kindergarten and beyond. But we see this as one factor within a developmental system that may be important for children's development. Some of the network's other papers, resources, and upcoming webinars are going to be addressing some other elements of children's experiences. So of course, we encourage you to come to future webinars and check out the website for additional information. All right, so to summarize, the motivation behind the work that we're presenting you with today is essentially to understand how children's pre-K and kindergarten experiences are similar or different from each other, and to discuss some approaches that we see as potentially valuable for bringing pre-K and kindergarten into greater alignment with each other. All right, well, Sue has already explained a little bit about the network, so I'm not going to go into details about the methods that have been used by different teams. There's a lot more information about each project in the network that's available on the Early Learning Network website, and I can say briefly that the teams represented racially, ethnically, and language diverse children and included samples collected in rural regions, suburban, and urban locations. So I'm going to start by talking about the evidence for alignment or misalignment between children's experiences of race and language in pre-K and kindergarten. So essentially, we asked the question, do pre-K and kindergarten provide children with race and language diverse teachers to an equal extent? We were interested in this question because there's some evidence that having a same race teacher or a same ethnicity teacher can be beneficial for children of color. And there's also substantial evidence that having some element of instruction in your home language or your first language is important to, it has benefits for English language learners and can actually help children as they master English as a second language. So when we looked at this issue in a very diverse urban and suburban school division, we found that children of color were much less likely to have a same race or same ethnicity teacher when they transitioned into kindergarten than they were in pre-K. There were far fewer teachers of color in kindergarten than there were in pre-K. And in fact, 42% of our pre-K teachers were from racially or ethnically minoritized backgrounds, while only 16% of pre-K teachers were. And similarly, we found that children were much more likely to be in a classroom where either the teacher or the teaching assistant spoke Spanish as a second language or as a first or second language. And in addition to that, children were transitioning into classrooms where a smaller proportion of children were categorized as limited English proficient. So to summarize, children were transitioning from sort of more diverse, linguistically and racially and ethnically diverse classrooms in pre-K into less diverse classrooms where they were more likely, if they were themselves a child of color or a child who's learning English as a second language, they were less likely to see that reflected in their teachers and peers. So what can we do about this? It's clearly a big problem. An obvious solution might be to prioritize the hiring and retention of more teachers and staff from varied ethnic and racial backgrounds. And that's, of course, a big project and a big challenge. It's not easy to do overnight. So some smaller steps that divisions can take as they work on that bigger problem is to really make sure that kindergarten is a welcoming place for children of color and English language learners, regardless of the race or language that their teachers speak. Along these lines, it's critically important to encourage school personnel to engage in some exploration and understanding of their own backgrounds, their own expectations, and their own biases, so that they can be aware of those potential biases or those expectations in their own teaching. And then, of course, it's critically important to represent diverse children and adults across multiple dimensions of diversity in books, images, activities, materials, and things that children interact with in the school setting. And then finally, there have been multiple organizations that have laid out best practices for culturally grounded teaching. And so that's another avenue that teachers can explore as they're trying to create this sort of welcoming environment for children coming from many different backgrounds. All right. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is this issue of alignment between teacher-child interactions in pre-K and kindergarten. We're interested in understanding whether the quality of teacher-child interactions is comparable across pre-K and kindergarten. This is important because interactions that are warm, supportive, and stimulating for children show small but very consistent associations with children's academic and social emotional development. We really want to create classrooms where children feel safe and appreciated and can really take advantage of the learning opportunities that are around them because they're being stimulated and also feel like so these are findings drawn from our research here at the University of Virginia, although other sites found similar results. We used the class observation to measure teacher-child interactions. The class is an observational measure that looks at 3 domains of interactions: the emotional support provided by the classroom, the organization, the classroom organization, and the instructional support. And all of these scores are on a scale of 1 to 7. When we compare pre-K and kindergarten interactions, we see that preschool interactions were slightly higher across all 3 domains that we measured. And although these differences are relatively small, on the order of a quarter to a half a point difference between pre-K and kindergarten on average, that is in the range of something that we would consider educationally meaningful and would be potentially noticeable by somebody walking into the classroom. All right, so how do we address this issue of teacher-child interactions? I would first of all say that we would love to see teacher-child interactions to be warmer and more positive across pre-K and kindergarten and into elementary school and beyond. So we would certainly recommend having teachers reflect on interactions and potentially engage in some professional development and coaching focused on improving their interactions with children. For kindergarten teachers in particular, we're aware that class sizes tend to be larger, and so it's a little bit more difficult sometimes to connect with children as individuals. So we would encourage school divisions and teachers to try to identify those opportunities to interact with children either individually or in small groups that allow for more of that relationship building. And one idea that we've heard from some of our practice partners is having parents in or teaching assistants in at certain times of day to help with activities so that the teacher can really focus on a smaller group of kids. And then lastly, it's of course important to think about supplemental curricula or social emotional learning practices that really encourage children to develop their autonomy, their sense of connection with other children, their ability to engage in social interactions and also to regulate their emotions so that they're able to engage in some of these really positive their social time. All right, and that is my section of the presentation, and I appreciate you being here and look forward to your questions, and you can always reach out to me at my email address. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly.
Okay. So I'm Kelly from Ohio State, and I'm really excited to be here sharing what we've learned as a network on this topic. So very similar to Ginny's presentation, I'm going to talk about 2 additional topics related to this transition. First, I'm going to talk about alignment of learning opportunities across pre-K to K, and then I'll talk a little bit about the connections between adults, both in terms of families and their role in the transition, as well as the adults in the pre-K system and the adults in the elementary school system. And with each topic, I'll talk a little bit about considerations for both practice and policy. So I'm going to start by talking about the alignment or misalignment of learning opportunities across pre-K to kindergarten. And when I say learning opportunities, I really just mean the opportunities that children have to learn within the classroom and the experiences that they're having, the ways in which they're spending their day while they're in the pre-K classroom or the kindergarten classroom. And one of the really consistent findings that we showed across multiple sites in this network was that learning opportunities look really different in pre-kindergarten and kindergarten. And this occurred both in terms of the time spent on academic content, so the time spent on literacy instruction, but also the ways in which the days were organized. So how much time children were spending in whole class settings versus working in small groups or exploring topics in a center. And we have concerns about this because having such abrupt transitions might make this overall transition more challenging for children as they're experiencing different expectations, such as being required to kind of sit still for direct instruction longer or have higher academic demands. These all might increase the challenges associated with the transition. And although some of it might be developmentally appropriate, I think still making sure that we have this predictable nature that Ginny was talking about earlier, something important to think about. So I'm going to show some data from our site at Ohio that really shows these differences across pre-K to K. But as I said, this was found across multiple sites. So this is data from observations that we did in pre-K and kindergarten classrooms, as well as in first grade classrooms, to kind of show whether kindergarten was looking more like a pre-kindergarten classroom or closer to a first grade classroom. And so just a couple things to point out on this slide. This is, of the time that we were observing, the proportion of time that kids were in different types of grouping. So what you can see here is three things I want to point out. One, kindergarten looks more like first grade than it does pre-K in terms of the way children are spending their time. We see that there's more time in both whole class environments, but also in individual work on your own settings in kindergarten as compared to pre-K, and less time spent in small group settings. When we turn to look at what type of activities were being done during the time, we also see pretty big differences between pre-K and kindergarten. So in kindergarten and first grade, we see a much higher proportion of time spent in direct instruction. We also see a much higher percentage, 11% in kindergarten, of time spent on worksheets. And we see a drastic reduction in the amount of time spent in centers, which are typically more child-directed activities. Lastly, we looked at academic content. So what was the topic of instruction during any given part of our observations? And this is also where we see really stark differences. We see a much higher proportion of time being spent focused on academic content, especially literacy and language, although we also see increases in math in kindergarten and first grade relative to what we saw in pre-K. We also saw, again, a lot of center time in pre-K, and it's not to say that there isn't academic content coming through in that center time. In this coding system, we weren't really able to disentangle that. But as a whole, I think these observations show that the instructional time in pre-K classrooms looks very different than the instructional time that children are experiencing in kindergarten classrooms. I do want to point out two other things that we're finding across the network related to learning opportunities. One is multiple sites are able to look at more detailed information on the content of instruction that's happening in pre-K and K. And work from the North Carolina site actually was just released on this week. But in general, these sites are showing that there's some content overlap and duplicity in content from pre-K to kindergarten. So kids are getting some of the same content multiple times. And now obviously that's not inherently bad. And so one of the things I think we're really interested in as a network moving forward is really disentangling what should be seen very similar across pre-K and K, and where should we see children's experiences begin to stretch and grow on what they've already learned. And one of the teams in the network, the Boston, is working on looking at this in Boston, who's explicitly tried to tackle this topic. And so they focus on what they call vertical alignment, which really just means alignment in experiences and curriculum and assessments from pre-K all the way to second grade. And in doing so, they're trying to build in some of the things that Ginny was talking about. And what's important to know is the way in which they're doing it is not necessarily just trying to push elementary school down into preschool. They're also trying to take practices that we know work in preschool, such as the use of small groups and center-based learning, and pull them up through elementary school to provide more of that continuity in children's experiences. So a few recommendations based on these initial findings. One, continuing to think about how we can develop academic experiences and content that build upon what children have already experienced is really important. But so is thinking about the ways in which that content is delivered and using instructional strategies and grouping practices that are similar to what children are expecting to experience based on what they've had in preschool. And lastly, and kind of moving us into my next topic, I think one of the big challenges and things we need to think about in order to do all of this is how do we bring together teachers and administrators from across the preschool sector and elementary schools to build alignment. Which, as I said, brings me to our next topic, which is about connections between adults. And I'm going to start by going back to this model that Ginny presented earlier to point out two pieces. One is the role of family connections. And so we know that family connections matter, but we haven't thought as much about them across this transition. And then I want you to kind of look at those kind of sort of circle square shapes, which really represent that preschool is a system or pre-K is a system and kindergarten is its own system. And so how do we think about how the adults in these systems connect to help promote more alignment in the other topics that we've been discussing? So starting with families, as I said, we know that connections between families and schools promote children's academic and behavioral success over time. And we also know that this might be particularly important during the transition to kindergarten because kindergarten is often a pattern setting period. So how kids do in kindergarten shapes how they experience the rest of elementary school and even beyond. And it's the same thing for parents. If they have positive experiences with their child's school at the beginning of that time in kindergarten, that's likely to help foster family engagement throughout the rest of elementary school. But one thing that the network is finding currently is that connections with families are actually decreasing across this transition. And some of the work that Sue and her team has found has shown that there's less school-based involvement, participating in school activities, things like that, but also communication between families and schools is decreasing across this transition. And so this is really important to think about for the future, but some of our ideas as to why this might be happening is some of the changing expectations about what this looks like. We also know that kindergarten teachers often have more children, and therefore building these relationships with families might be harder when there are more kids in their classroom as opposed to a preschool classroom. But there's also lots of other logistical things. So an elementary school classroom is much more likely to end at 3 o'clock when parents may still be working, as opposed to a preschool classroom where the teachers may be there until 5, and allowing more of these connection building opportunities to happen at drop off and pick up and things like that. But switching gears, I also want to talk about the connections across pre-K and K. And so the network as a whole has started to look at this from a systemic perspective, but I'm going to talk mostly about data from interviews that I did with preschool teachers and kindergarten teachers, as well as principals and administrators across the state of Ohio, really focused on how do they connect. And so one of the things we found was that there are a lot of challenges or barriers that prevent connections forming between pre-K teachers and kindergarten teachers. One of them is the fact that they are really working within different systems. So pre-K teachers might be working in a school and be kind of a part of the district system, but they're also very likely to be working in the Head Start system, or they might be a private center-based provider. And these different systems don't always connect to one another. There's also kind of logistical challenges. For any of you teachers on, I'm sure you know that your plates are already more than full, and the idea of adding on another responsibility is really hard, especially when in many districts, preschools are not within the elementary school. And that's because they're part of these different systems. But even what we see in Ohio is in districts that have had rapid growth, they don't have room to have the preschool classrooms in the elementary schools. And so they're in a separate building. And how do we bring together people in that situation? And there's also some different goals happening. All of the teachers that I talked to had the same goal of helping children succeed, but because they work in these different systems, they had different orientations. So preschool teachers are often thinking about the quality rating improvement system that is happening in their state, whereas elementary teachers might be more thinking about preparing their kids for later elementary school when they're likely to encounter high stakes testing and other things that have big influences on their educational trajectory. So I think that there are a lot of challenges, but I also think that figuring out ways to reduce these barriers is critical to improving the transition for children, because it has the ability to reduce the types of misalignment that Ginny and I have been talking about today. It opens up communication pathways for teachers to talk to one another about children's needs as they make this transition. And it can increase the predictability and experiences for both children and for families. So a few quick recommendations. I think we need to focus on building sustained connections with families that might start during the preschool years, but continue throughout kindergarten. One thing that we have learned during this pandemic is maybe thinking about virtual options is one way to ensure that parents have more than kind of just one touch point with their children's teachers. I will also say that the webinar in 2 weeks is on family engagement. And so I think there'll be some great thoughts brought up then. Another suggestion is to really think about professional development as an activity that should involve both preschool and elementary school personnel together. This can be a big lift because it often involves the community really coming together to identify all of the different preschool systems that should be at the table with the elementary school. But by thinking about professional development or teaching techniques together, it can help to reduce misalignment and also just build connections across people. And lastly, from more of a policy perspective, thinking about building systems that can foster information sharing and communication. So one example is data systems that don't just include experiences or information on children's skills, but also include information on the experiences they've had, the curriculum they've been exposed to, so that every time a child enters a classroom with a new teacher, that teacher has a better sense of where that child is coming from. And so with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Sue to turn us to Q&A.
Fabulous. Thank you to Ginny, and thank you, Kelly, for really excellent presentations. It's always fun hearing about the new data that you have coming out from your projects. And I appreciate the fact that you've been able to couch some of the findings and recommendations in terms of things that really we're finding across the network, which is one of the most important aspects of this work. We're really working collectively to address these really thorny issues for the field, by learning from and with one another as we go forward. So I will put in another plug for those upcoming webinars too. Again, they mentioned 1 and 2 weeks on family engagement, but there's a few others down the road that we'll chat about a little bit later and make sure that folks are aware of. It's an opportunity for us to share in real time some of the findings of the network that can begin to help us modify our practices and policies at a time when things are changing and we really need to understand in a data-based way what's most important for children's healthy development, and certainly transitions, and alignment across systems and over time from pre-K to kindergarten and beyond is one of these things that is malleable, that we really can control in our practices and encourage our policymakers to think about. So this is just such a germane topic. I'm thrilled that you were able to share not only the cutting edge data that are coming out of your studies, but also some really practical recommendations for us. We do have a number of questions that have been coming in through the Q&A and through the chat box, and so I'm going to just get started, if you don't mind. I'm going to open it up to both Ginny and Kelly, because even though they might have been questions that were specific to, one or the other presentations, I do think both of you probably have some things that you might be able to comment on. So let's start by really going back to some recommendations. Okay, you both had a number of recommendations that are really relevant for our audience. Can you provide some specific recommendations for hiring diverse teaching staff in locations that struggle with attracting and retaining qualified teaching staff? I know, Ginny, this was one of the recommendations that you had in terms of that sort of alignment, if you will, or that match between provider and student. What about in settings where there is not a lot of ethnic and racial and language diversity? How do we grapple with that issue?
So this is a really tough one, and that's why I didn't want to leave that as the only recommendation. There's certainly other things that programs can do to make children feel welcome. I have a couple things. Something that we're working on in my own research center as well is trying to take a look at our culture and our practices and try to understand whether some of the difficulty with recruiting racially minoritized or other groups of people might be related to sort of how we interact with each other. And so we've been doing something of a self-reflection process to try and understand how we can be a more welcoming culture. So I present that as an example of a place where I think a lot of workplaces can continue to sort of grow and continuously try to envision what a more welcoming environment looks like. The other thing I would say is getting parents in to volunteer. And another thing is, if you are a place where there's a university or there's a high school where you might have students, volunteers come in, I think just having any sort of role model or any connection to children's home culture or language culture is critically important. So thinking a little bit about how you bring different people in, and if it's hard to hire teachers, could you set up a university connection program or a connection with the local high school to have students come in and interact with younger kids?
Great. Thanks, Ginny. There's actually a follow-up question along these same lines. And so I'm just going to throw this out there. And it's the case that maybe everybody who's participating today, if you have thoughts on this, you can put your thoughts in chat. We have a person wondering if anyone can share resources on best practices for culturally grounded teaching. It's another concept that you mentioned, Ginny. Are there resources out there on best practices for culturally grounded teaching? And I think we have probably a wealth of expertise here. If you have any thoughts, Ginny, that'd be great, but others too.
I would. So if anybody wants to paste some resources in, I can share that your resources back to the attendees as well. Somebody's just commented in exactly what I was about to say, which is NACCE. If you look at the NACCE website, they have wonderful resources, and I will. I saw that question, and so I have pulled up a few different resources that I want to share. So I'll put those into the chat box. And then another place, we have a former colleague who's at University of Pittsburgh. They have a wonderful center. It is I think it's the Center for Child Development or something like that, but I'll paste a link. They have a wonderful set of resources, book lists, they've written articles. And then the last thing I will say is a colleague of ours has this wonderful book. I will plug it for her since she's not here with us. It is a book about embracing anti-bias classrooms in early childhood education. The authors are Ioma Iruka, Dr. Currington, Tanya Durden, and Carrie Ann Eskig. And it is an absolutely wonderful resource that I've talked to different teacher groups that are doing like a book reading kind of group to discuss that. And it really goes through like some of the sources of bias and then how you might address it within a program.
Thank you for mentioning that, Ginny. Dr. Iruka, Ioma Iruka, is actually part of the network as well. She's a member of the Nebraska research team. So a wealth of expertise here in all kinds of different areas. Okay, a couple more questions. Let me see. Let's talk about children's friendships for a minute. How are children's friendships being used to help them make healthy transitions? Elementary schools sometimes choose to split up close friendships during early grades to decrease off-task behaviors, other kinds of behaviors that we don't like, when the data actually support having at least one very close best friend is important to resiliency during transitions. Kelly, I know your study is looking at social networks in classrooms. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really great point, and I'm glad it got brought up. Our work aligns with that having one good friend really changes the classroom experience for a child in a really positive way. We, in this study, we haven't looked at it across the transition as much as we probably need to go back to our data and do so. But we do have some information on teachers' grouping strategies and when they're doing those things. One thing that we're trying to do in another one of our projects that's somewhat related to this is we're actually working with preschool teachers to try to have them in the spring of the preschool year create small groups within the classroom of kids that will be attending the same school in the following year. And this is hard to do because not every kid knows which school they're going to be in, and we don't know the class assignments. But we're trying to foster friendships, or at least knowing a child that's going to be in your classroom already, so that kids have some of that resiliency as they enter this big transition. But I think overall, it's kind of been underexplored as a potential way to help kids adjustment. And so I'm glad you brought it up here, because I think we're hoping to continue to do more work on that in the future.
Super important. And I'll tell you, the whole issue of the isolation and loneliness that some children have felt during this COVID period when schools were closed or there's a lot of remote learning going on, really kind of drives home the importance of remembering about relationships and the importance of relationships in children's learning. So that was, a really nice way to introduce that back into the conversation as well. One participant asked about whether or not you overlaid the developmental milestones of children with the way learning opportunities were structured in pre-K and kindergarten. And as a follow-up, they asked to further elaborate, the variance in development of children is still pretty broad as children transition from pre-K in June and then enter kindergarten that following fall. So did we overlay the developmental milestones with the way these learning opportunities were structured at all? Either you have thoughts on that?
I can start. So we haven't necessarily overlaid developmental milestones. In part, I'm not sure that our data is granular enough to really be able to do that. But I completely agree with the variability point. And I think that is, so there's the natural developmental variability that you're talking about. And then there's the variability that Ginny presented when she was setting us up, which is, and I saw someone bring up in the chat, which is not all kids go to preschool and their experiences within preschool are very different. And so the amount of variability that a kindergarten teacher is navigating in their classroom, especially in those first couple months, it is huge. And unfortunately, I'm even more concerned about it now, thinking about this upcoming fall when experiences have been even more diverse for children across the past year. So I think that's why, a lot of what I presented and a lot of what we've seen so far in this network is descriptive, but understanding kind of what the optimal transition looks like, I think we're still trying to nail down. And I think to your point is going to look different. Some of that redundancy is probably really great for some kids, but it might produce boredom for other kids. And so figuring out how we do this is a critical question, but it's also not a question that I have a great answer to at this point.
I would add to what Kelly said that what I think you would see the recommendation is coming from sort of, education organizations and organizations that interact with elementary teachers, going down on structures. And although the network has not dealt with differentiated instruction directly, in some of our other work, we see that the way teachers make that work is typically through partnering up for planning. And so, groups will do team planning. They'll look at the data. They'll look at different ways to group kids to get the most out of different types of lessons. And then they'll sort of collaboratively come up with a series of activities that that could be targeting maybe the same skill or the same sub-skill, but in sort of different ways so that children who are a little bit more advanced can engage with the topic in a slightly more complex way. And children who need a little bit more support can sort of have a lot of, environmental supports like manipulatives and, scaffolded activities and things like that. And I would just echo what Kelly says. I think when we talk to pre-K providers this year, it's just been really variable what kids have gotten. A lot of kids who would have been in pre-K have been at home. A lot of pre-K programs are doing virtual instruction, and you hear a lot of frustration from pre-K teachers about how that's going and what the expectations of them are. So I feel for kindergarten teachers next year. I think they have a really diverse cohort coming in that's going to really stretch everybody's skills and patience, and so yeah.
Good. Thanks to both of you. We probably have time for another, maybe one or two more questions. Ginny, there is a question directed to you, and so I'll pose it because I think it's important. In the Virginia sample, did you look at differences in teachers' attitudes towards the practices measured in class? A lot of our, nationwide a lot of programs are using class, both in pre-K and now in elementary. So did you see differences in attitudes toward the practices that are measured in class? And this seems like there could be a trade-off with the content knowledge instruction.
Yes, I think that, so we did not look at that, and I wish in some ways we had. We collect a lot of data, and we just have made decisions and not been able to sort of collect data on everything we possibly could. But I would say that I think that this question is really touching on something critically important, which is there a trade-off between having these kind of developmentally appropriate experiences for kids versus meeting the standards that kids are supposed to be have mastered by the end of kindergarten. So we hear from kindergarten teachers that they feel at this point that there's no opportunity to ease kids in, and that the expectation is that they start on the academic content like right out of the gate, and they whereas previously they might have spent the first month or so sort of in more transitional activities where they're, really just trying to get kids acclimated to kindergarten and the expectations that, many teachers tell us that they don't feel like they have that liberty at this point, because it's just this drumbeat of, they've got the handoff to first grade teachers at the end of the year, and the kids have got to be doing X, Y, and Z. So I think that, I think that is like part of the core struggle of what early childhood education is right now. And when we say early childhood education, I think we mean all the way up to third grade. What are we doing with kids, and why are we doing it, and what's the long-term benefit or outcome of doing things the way we're doing them? And I think there are arguments on both sides. There are arguments that, kids need to have mastered certain skills, and that, if they haven't mastered these skills, they're going to be the disadvantaged over the long term. And then there's other, people like who focus more on social emotional development would argue that kids are kids, and that they need to have some of these social experiences and these connections, and that, the connections they feel with a teacher or other adults in their world is just absolutely critical and foundational to their experiences. So I don't think that the research is settled on that, but I think that that this question is really touching the heart of sort of an existential conflict of sorts that we have right now.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no easy answers to a lot of these questions, for sure. Well, that brings us pretty much to our time today. Thank you very much to both Ginny and Callie for again sharing your very current findings, providing recommendations, and helping to grapple with some of these ongoing issues that hopefully we're going to be shedding light on as we continue to really collect the data and understand the data that are being generated across the country through this network. I, in closing, am going to invite all of you to register for our upcoming webinars this spring. On May 4th, we'll be exploring the role of family engagement and at-home learning in supporting children's development. On May 18th, we'll focus clearly and squarely on diversity, equity, and inclusion in early learning, and examine systemic and instructional factors to promote more equitable opportunities and outcomes for children of color. And finally, on June 1st, we'll discuss the importance of using assessment and observation tools to guide individualized instruction, particularly as it relates to literacy. More information can be found at earlylearningnetwork.unl.edu. And finally, I will remind you that a recording of today's webinar, as well as the slides, will be available on our website very soon. For more learning, for deeper learning, for greater understandings of what is happening in the network and how some of our findings can be informative relating to policy and practice. We encourage you to download our research policy brief that outlines some of the information discussed today, but also other policy briefs and practice briefs that are available now on our website that hit squarely on some of the findings of the network and begin to help translate the findings into these practice and policy recommendations. You'll find these resources under the tools and resources link on our website, and also a link that's now being posted in the chat. We have a lot of information, a lot of resources available, both paper as well as video, and other kinds of social media resources, blogs, etc., on our website. So please spend a little bit of time, and you'll find it to be a very rich, wealth of information. We do encourage you to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Join our mailing list, and you'll receive all of these things as they come out, hot off the press. This includes research news, updates on webinars, on events, on our publications, on our blog posts, et cetera, et cetera. So this concludes our webinar today. Thank you again to Ginny and Kelly. Thanks to everybody who is here today. Please stay in touch with us. Please keep us apprised of how we can provide information to you and in the best way, and in the most timely way, so that it can inform policy practice, but also research, because I know many of you who are joining us are partners with us in trying to understand and unpack much more effectively the kinds of things that really matter for children's learning and development. And so we're in it together. We want to stay in touch, and we invite you to continue to dialogue with us. Have a wonderful Tuesday, and we look forward to seeing you all again at our next webinar. Bye-bye now.